Awesome. Aloha and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Madeline, and I'm with Pacific Coffee Research. And our presentation this morning is called Hawaii in a Global Market with Joan Obra of Rusty's Hawaiian in Ka'u and Marcus Young of Boot Coffee in Northern California. So just an introduction here. Many of us know Joan through the local coffee industry, but just in case you don't know her work, Joan is a Hawaii agriculturist whose work stretches throughout the state. As a grant writer, she's helped multiple ag industries raise almost $800,000 to support exports, train coffee farmers in quality processing, and improve soil health on coffee farms. Joan is a co-owner of Rusty's Hawaiian and the award-winning Ka'u Coffee Farm, Mill, and Roastery. And in 2019, Hawaii Business Magazine named Joan a 20 for the Next 20 leader. She's worked on multiple projects to explore emerging markets for Hawaii-grown coffee and comes to this discussion with knowledge in developing business relationships abroad and understanding different markets' needs and wants. Marcus is joining us today from Northern California, where he works for Boot Coffee. With over 18 years of experience in the industry, Marcus is a licensed Q Arabica grader and authorized HCA trainer. He works as an advisor to numerous consumer brands and roasting companies and has authored numerous articles in coffee industry publications. Marcus is a seasoned coffee lecturer at events ranging from TEDx, Brazil's International Coffee Week, HCA Expo, and for private trade groups. Marcus co-founded 2 successful coffee roasting companies in Portland, Oregon, and in Kigali, Rwanda. To this discussion, he brings a broad perspective of Hawaii's role in the coffee industry today and identifies possibilities for future growth and development. So thank you both for being here and sharing your knowledge and insight and participating in this. And I'm just going to be here to kind of moderate questions and things. Don't worry too much about the chat box. I will kind of answer what I can through the chat box myself and then prompt questions for anything that I can't answer.
Okay, great.
Yeah, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Madeline and Joan. It's an honor to be here with both of you as well. So,
oh, you guys we're gonna have some fun today. We had a really good and long chat about this this webinar beforehand, and I definitely learned a lot from you, Marcus, and excited to continue the conversation today.
Yeah, likewise. I hope that that we can, despite the fact that we uploaded some slides, I hope that this can be conversational and not feel like we're just on a train track following some.
Right. And to that end, I'm not sure, how do we pull up this handout here? Ah, there we go. Great. Okay, so I guess we'll turn it over to you, Madeline. You're driving the conversation here.
We wanted to start off kind of just looking at Hawaii as a coffee growing region, right? And looking at what our numbers are for this year. And I believe, Joan, you were able to pull these most recent numbers from USDA and talk about what we found.
Yeah, and so basically for folks who are looking for these types of statistics, they're always put out by the USDA, the Natural Agricultural Statistics Service, NASS, and we do have a state statistician here in Hawaii. So for a long time, it was Kathy King, and then Kathy King retired, and Sean Clark took over. So that's the person who I got these numbers from. And this is what it looks like. This is a release from January 23, and I was looking at these numbers for some of the grant writing that I do, and they said that these numbers are staying current, but of course they're estimates, and they will, the latest seasons will get updated. So what's important to keep in mind for the 2019-2020 season, which is the one that just wrapped up, is that it looks like our utilized coffee production in terms of cherry basis is down 1% from the previous season, and our bearing acreage is down 200 acres from the previous year, so totaling 6,900. And this gives you a better look at what the, I'm pausing here because there's a lot of information that's coming up that's sort of blocking my screen. So let me see if I can, pull that. Okay, great. So according to NASS, our yield estimate for 2019 and 2020, this past season, is about 5.07 million pounds of green beans, and that's down from 5.48 million pounds in the previous season. And because of also, in terms of our farm revenue for coffee, we're looking at an estimate of $88.76 million of green beans being sold in the 2019-2020 season, and this is down from 106.31 million in the previous season. So I actually questioned these stats because, as we all know, there were the volcanic eruptions here in 2018 that cut short the Kona season. So there were folks who were starting to prune in October, which is quite early for us. And it also had an effect in Ka'u. However, Sean couldn't really tell me exactly what was going on because those numbers were put together by Kathy King before she retired. So I suspect a couple of things happened. Potentially, Kauai had a really good bumper crop that made up for Kona's loss. Or, as Sean pointed out, since these are all estimates based on surveys from the farmers, at the point when they collected the information, it might not have been apparent how much the volcanic eruptions were going to hurt us. But in any case, if anyone wants to see these statistics, they are definitely publicly available and they're updated several times a year. And then, as Madeline said, wanted to go through and talk about the Hawaii coffee industry for a minute and give you guys a sense of the scope of it. So many people think of Hawaii as Kona coffee, but we actually have 8 different growing regions. And one of the things that we had done with some of the grant money that I do the grant writing for was put together a 28-page booklet called Grown with Aloha, a guide to Hawaii's coffee industry today, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And this is actually downloadable off of the Hawaii Coffee Association website. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's the very last link on the homepage if you scroll all the way down. So anybody can go ahead and take a look at this. But I've gone ahead and pulled a few slides to give you a better sense of what our industry is like here. So as I said, there are 8 different growing regions and they all have slightly different characteristics. So this region, there's a region called Hamakua. You know, I should have ordered this a different way. So let me skip ahead and I'll show you this map first, and then we can go back and look. So the 8 growing regions are divided up amongst these different islands, right? Our major islands here in Hawaii. So we have 4 of the major growing regions on the Big Island. You've got Hamakua in the north, Kona in the west, Ka'u in the south, and Puna in the east and the southeast. Then you've got Maui coffee, and that's its own origin. Molokai is its own origin, Oahu is its own origin, and Kauai coffee, that's its own origin as well. And so when we do our promotions around the world, one of the key things that we are doing is telling folks that Hawaii is more than just Kona coffee. So that means a variety of different elevations, different climates, a variety of different varieties and different processing methods as well. So now I'll go back and tell you a little bit more about each one. So Hamakua, the region in the north, at the time of this publication, about 15 to 20 farms, growing areas about 45 acres, and you've got a wide range of elevations here, so between 350 and 2,500 feet. And then Ka'u is bigger, so that's the opposite side of the island, the area in the south. And Ka'u has an interesting history. This is a pretty big growing region because this whole area used to be sugarcane. So what happened was in 1996, the sugarcane industry pulled out of Ka'u and it left a lot of people unemployed. Just to give you a sense, where we are in Ka'u and Pahala, that's an hour outside of Hilo and 2 hours outside of Kona. And so the folks who were left jobless basically tapped into a fund provided by one of our senators to transform these failed sugar plantation or other plantation economies into something new. And that's precisely what Ka'u did. They broke up the big abandoned fields into leased small family farms and basically made an attempt that's been fairly successful in terms of turning this place into an enclave of small entrepreneurs. So that's why you have so many farms here in Ka'u. So you've got about 80 to 90. Growing area at the time of this writing is about 830 acres. And our elevation is between 1,100 and 2,700 feet. Next, we have Kona, and everybody knows Kona. So obviously there are a lot of farms in Kona, between 90 to 1,000 are the growing areas between 3,800 and 4,000 acres. And the elevation really ranges between 500 to 3,000 feet. So a lot of people think about Kona as the classic Kona typica, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But traditionally speaking, Kona was kind of known for having a specific flavor profile, but that's really broadened in recent years, especially with the addition of other varieties other than Kona typica. And just that elevation alone is going to produce a lot of different flavors with that kind of range. So in Kona, you're basically looking at a mix of smaller farms and bigger farms. And likewise here in Ka'u, we've got some bigger farms, but mostly smaller farms as well. And then we can move to Hawaii. So this is actually the area that's most known in the Hawaii area is Puna, the southeast area. So about 20 plus farms, growing area of 125 acres. Look at that wide range in elevation again, between 300 and 2,600 feet. This area is really known for being very wet. Hilo's one of the rainiest cities in the United States. So that definitely impacts the flavor of the coffee that we have here. And most of these farms are quite small. And then we move to Maui, completely different island from the Big Island. So this growing area is about 600 acres, and it's split. In Lahaina, you have one large commercial operation, Maui Grown, and that's about 500 acres. And then in upcountry Maui, you have about 100 acres in these smaller independently owned farms. So again, these are really very vastly different climates. So you're going to get a lot of variation in that coffee. And then we can move to Molokai, which is a separate island. That's 150 acres. And this is pretty much concentrated in one plantation there. So not a lot of independent smaller growers on Molokai at all. And then we move to the island of Oahu. This is a growing area of about 160 acres. And this is primarily split between Wailua Estates and then also the Hawaii Agricultural Research Center Park. So those are the two main areas on Oahu. And then finally, we get to Kauai, and that is a growing area of about 3,000 acres. And most of that is, all in one farm, Kauai coffee. So that being a big operation there, as we also have one on Oahu and one on Maui, those areas are known, the bigger operations, for mechanical harvesting. So we also have that variety in picking methods, whereas the smaller farms will hand pick. The very big farms have the scales needed to make mechanical harvesting the better way to go as far as cost. So that gives you an idea. I hope that gives you all an idea of the range and the variety of what we do see here throughout the islands. And again, you can certainly download this, and there's lots of other information in that booklet as well. Okay.
Yeah, and something I kind of wanted to bring up is that a lot of this information will directly tie back to something that we'll bring up a little bit later on in this conversation. So it's important to kind of keep this in the back of your mind of how diverse Hawaii as a growing region really is. Not just from island to island, but even the different smaller regions and just elevation alone, how much that impacts what you end up getting from, even if you're doing the same variety across 3 different elevations, the same processing method. How does that impact it? And so we're going to talk about that a little bit later too. But yeah, thank you, Joan, for that. And something else that I kind of wanted to take note of is that we see, again, a lot of people like to kind of talk about Hawaii coffee as a whole, but it is so different too in how it's produced and how the cost of production affects the final price that it's being sold for, right? And so a lot of the time we talk about, Big Island is hand harvested coffee, where on Maui, Oahu, and Kauai, you'll find mechanically harvested coffee. And so that helps with bringing down your cost of production, which is reflective in the pricing of those coffees. And so it's something that I like to always just bring up in any conversation that has anything to do, that touches on price of Hawaii coffee in any way, is like, we look at the cost of production here, and it's very different from the cost of production in most other coffee growing regions around the world because of our minimum wages and labor laws and all of these other things that are here that are very different compared to other nations around the world. So I like to always just keep that context in the back of our minds too when we're talking about coffee production in Hawaii. But we're going to also now kind of go into what market desires are in general for coffee and how does that apply to Hawaii. And so I believe, Marcus, were you the one who found this great? You were doing the research with the National Coffee Association and found this information and breakdown of rating basically what people want to see in their coffee, right?
Exactly. It's kind of a funny question, but that the NCA asks. And for this slide and the next couple that we'll be looking at is like really fundamental to some of the work that I do, and working with producers globally is really helping to understand what is a consumer market looking for, both in the US, which the NCA survey speaks to, but also kind of more broadly and more globally, which I know Joan will also speak to a little bit. So it's a combination, with this data here, and then some slides we'll look at later on, that's some research that we conducted internally here at Boot Coffee, asking a global range of coffee buyers what they're looking for. Mm-hmm. But I think, to me, this is such an interesting and core fundamental slide on the National Coffee Data Trends Survey. And every year they basically ask, what aspects or what facets of coffees are going to make you much more or somewhat more likely to buy that coffee. And this is just kind of a running rank, and we don't have to go through the whole list, but it runs from really funny thing, right, like added collagen and probiotics, to things that I think as coffee professionals, coffee producers, we're probably thinking about a little bit more intensely, like quality and how the farms are operating from a sustainability perspective. And really the biggest takeaway I think out of this is when you just look at the top 12, kind of the dozen most important indicators, 9 of them are related to sustainability. And I think it's interesting to think about this in the context of Hawaii and the context of the challenges of elevated costs of production, and kind of in this overarching, discussion that we're having of, how does Hawaii succeed even more successfully in a global market given some of those challenges? And I think, some of these are possible ways to talk about your coffee and investments to start making, and things to talk about, right? I think a lot of producers are doing these things already. They're treating their workers well, right? Some of it, of course, in the US is kind of baked into our labor laws. But, how are you engaging with charitable causes in your own communities or more internationally? And grown in an environmentally sustainable way, supporting communities that produce the coffee, than some of these more sort of traditional certifications. But the real takeaway is that consumers do care about this. I think the challenges, and something that I kind of keep coming back to though, is the question that's not answered here is, will the consumers pay for it? And the answer to my mind is no, for the most part. Sort of taking these ideas, we conducted a survey about 9 months ago asking, and it was ongoing over a several month period, asking a number of coffee roasting companies, what do your customers care about right now? And, as we parsed through that data, we saw that, they thought that sustainability was, somewhat important, very important, or essential. Certifications being less so, which I think is very interesting because, on the one hand, when you're working in sustainability and working in coffee, we're all hyper aware of greenwashing and making sustainability claims that are just used for a marketing pitch. But it's interesting that those clearly are resonating with consumers, even if you're not putting the rubber stamp of a third party on that. But then I think asking roasters and coffee buyers to look into the future, they find that these will be much more important in 5 years' time. So much so that it's like sustainability becomes almost all encompassing. Nobody really indicated that it was less important to them. And I'm also watching the chat here, and I see somebody is asking if this was a nationwide or a worldwide survey. And this was a global survey. Most of the respondents were in the US, but the second largest number of respondents were European, followed by Asian roasting companies. But it was like 75% US buyers. And then we started asking just with slider bars on this survey, how much you agreed with some statements. One being that specialty coffee becomes a leading clean industry. There were energy efficient, reducing fossil fuels, et cetera. And again, that was somewhat important. This, I think, is really intriguing for roasting companies. And I think it's where, perhaps as roasters and as so many producers in Hawaii that are roasters themselves, is looking at sort of profit sharing models. And roasting companies are really interested in this. And I think this especially applies to sort of higher value coffees. And it's, thinking about as producers, how do you sort of tap into your clients and the success your clients are having with your coffee, helping them to succeed. So in turn, maybe they can succeed and develop various types of profit sharing models. And I think this is very fundamental to Hawaiian coffee, but in general, it's not a dramatic slide here. It's not an overwhelming agreement, but most roasters and retailers and importers that responded to this survey also found that more farmers will start owning part of their brand and the added value of roasted product or brewed product even, which I think that's, for a lot of the world, Hawaii is looked at as an example of how to do that. And we see this increasing constantly. In Indonesia, we see more local production. We're seeing, of course, Brazil now is consuming as much coffee internally as they're exporting. So I think it's a major value add that you all are already doing well, but that also now means that there's sort of a whole other realm of competition from other coffee producers that are also roasting and selling that product directly. And it's amazing how many calls we get from producers in places like Panama and Costa Rica, East Africa, sort of looking to get into this business themselves, both for the domestic market, but also for an export market. And of course, when we think about roasting customers, you can't ignore JAB and the consolidation that's happened in this market in general. And this is a major component of the future of coffee. We've seen a ton of consolidation, both kind of at the more commercial end, but also at the specialty end, where in retail coffee right now, Nestle and JAB own more than 40% of that market, right? And so it's Nestle's purchase of companies like Blue Bottle, it's JAB getting into the game, not just with Keurig and Jacobs Dow Egberts, but with more specialty brands like Stumptown and Intelligentsia, Peet's Coffee, which kind of was an early one, of course. But then lots of other companies playing in this role too, with Coca-Cola buying Costa Coffee and developing their own dynamic coffee system, with Lavazza buying Mars Coffee, and Allegro, which has always been a favorite coffee company of mine that does really good coffee at a large scale, is now part of Amazon. So, what does this mean for the future of coffee and the future of the types of coffees that we'll be discussing a little bit later on, that producers need to be ready to provide to the marketplace. But I think the flip side of that coin, and this is back to our survey, is that while it's not kind of overwhelming, but many of the clients that we see, and I'm sure it's the same for you, Madeline, at PCR, we know that more and more coffee houses are looking to roast their own coffee, that more and more sort of hobbyists are looking to make this a part of the business. So I really see the coffee industry, at least up until maybe 4 months ago, because COVID is a whole other discussion to have here. But it was kind of fracturing, where the bigger folks were just getting larger, and that in the wake of kind of these regional companies getting absorbed, all of these like tiny micro roasters, the folks that are only ever interested in buying, 1 to 5, maybe 10 bags of coffee, are coming in and filling in that wake. And of course, they all want to feel like they have a direct relationship with the Hawaiian coffee farmers. They want to feel like they have a direct relationship with whoever they're buying from, and that they're buying something very special and very unique. And Joan, this was a great slide that you had that I think speaks to this kind of innovative retail concepts and just how out of the box people are starting to think right now.
Right. And kind of going back to what you were talking about earlier about more coffee houses becoming micro roasters themselves. In Asia, they're called bean shops, right? And so everyone's got a tiny little roaster, and some of them are roasting to order. And one of the things that we look at when we are marketing Hawaiian coffee in places like Asia is understanding not just in terms of what they're looking for product, but also understanding how we need to present ourselves. And so Madeline knows, because she went to the Taiwan International Coffee Show last November as part of a team there to do some research, because the Hawaii Coffee Association is going to start having its own trade show booth to be able to facilitate these direct relationships with roasters there and with importers there. And basically, when Madeline came back, one of the things that I had heard was, oh, wow, everything is so beautifully designed there. So we're really going to have to increase our game in order to be taken seriously. So this was a really good example of that. So this is what's going on in this photo, linking coffee. All these kind of circular areas that you see, these are all containing green beans. And then these little test tube looking things at the bottom, these are all roasted coffee. And I don't know if you can see, but they all have, the roasted coffee vials are attached to a device that resembles a perfume atomizer with a squeeze ball. So you could basically say, okay, I'm going to look at this green coffee, and then I'm also going to be able to smell what it's like roasted. So this is the type of sophisticated presentation that they look for in terms of trade shows, but also in terms of packaging, which is what we're going to get to a bit later on.
Yeah, and I love that idea of bean shops, right? It's I was having a conversation on social media with someone the other day as we were sort of thinking about the future of retail coffee in the US, but I think it kind of applies globally as well. And his point was, boy, think back 30 years ago. There was this really defining moment, and it was kind of led by Howard Schultz, where up to that point, Peet's and Starbucks and so many successful coffee companies were bean shops. There were places for people to buy coffee to take home and prepare. And kind of at that point, the whole industry curved and cafes became restaurants, right? But now I think we see folks coming sort of maybe back around to drinking more coffee at home and these kind of innovative concepts. So I love this idea. It was such a great, powerful slide.
Yeah, definitely. I actually wanted to just back up a little bit, because there was a question about a specific question about the that survey from the National Coffee Association. And I don't know if you know the answer for this, Marcus, but the scale at which those numbers were given, it says like,
yes,
workers on increased from 49 to 51. Was that out of a total of, those 2,700 respondents, or is it 58, 49 people rated that one as the most important, and then 51 people rated
I believe that those are percentages. So you can make multiple selections from the list when you take this as a respondent. So it's things that are really, I'm almost certain.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, hopefully that. I just brought back this slide again so that we can sort of see what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So you sort of see elevated percentages because people can pick multiple things. So I think it's interesting to kind of look at them all laid out as in mass.
Yeah, oh, definitely.
That's great. And I also, I also saw in the chat window, somebody was asking to make this relevant to small Hawaiian coffee farmers, which it's coming. We're kind of setting the stage first, and both Joan and I.
But I will say this, Marcus, if you could go back to that slide that you had, is that for those of us who are growing coffee here in Hawaii, and you can see what the priorities are, I would say take a look at this list and figure out what is it you're doing at your own farm that's that you can check off of this list, and then you're able to use that in your own marketing.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and I think that's really, I think that's really important that a lot of farmers here are already practicing a lot of these things,
right.
but we're not marketing it to our fullest potential. Because to us, it seems so natural that, like, yeah, of course, everybody on my farm is being paid, X amount. Of course, they have access to running water and a bathroom and all of these things while they're working. And it seems kind of just like a duh thing to us, but these are things that people want to know are actually happening on farms. And we can definitely, just kind of tap into that marketing angle, I guess, and really bring that to light and say, yes, this is truly a fair coffee that we're getting. Even if maybe we don't have that certification of fair trade, here are the things that we do on our farm. This is what a work day maybe looks like, and really using that as much as you can to say this is good coffee.
Yeah, 100%, and it helps to explain some of the expense as well to buyers. As we have a high minimum wage, and we have to pay these pickers and mill operators at this level, and
yes,
I think it becomes a really compelling piece of the story.
Yeah. David here just asked, what would be the best way to market those good practices without paying for a certification stamp? Social media, your website, really just using the internet and really, making videos of spotlighting maybe people who some of your employees, and having a video of their workday and what they do, and have them talk about what they do and why they work for you. Things like that. And really just a lot of it comes down to the fact that consumers want to feel connected to the product that they're purchasing.
Exactly. And we have some examples of this, I think, later on in the presentation too. So
yeah, exactly. And so it really just comes down to sharing, what you're already doing.
Yeah, it is. They should be joyful stories to tell. And I think we all get wrapped up in sort of our own day-to-day operations and businesses, and being able to take that step back is tough. It's a lot of the work that we do when I'm working with producers, and anytime I'm in Hawaii and meeting with farmers and the employees of the farmers, the children of you all, it's amazing the stories that are there, and like the passion and the expertise, and tapping into sort of sharing that is so important. And I think along those lines, it's interesting. This is just a word cloud of some of the top phrases that we pulled out of the question in our survey of asking folks to describe their vision for the future of specialty coffee's next wave, right? We've kind of been stuck in this third wave for a long time. What's the fourth, or what's the no wave coffee? And you can see it's nothing quite percolates to the surface, but in general, I notice ideas of quality, these kind of direct trade principles, issues that are related to farming and farmers, processing and trade. You see farming right there, pay. So I think that's really, really important. And if we sort of think back to those NCA results, a lot of these are really core to those kind of ideas of sustainability right there. And then just some nice, I think, hopeful and forward-looking for producers as well. And this is just what Madeline was saying in answer to the question of how do you market that. These coffee buyers really do believe that the role of roasters are going to be de-emphasized. and consumers are looking for a greater connection to the people that are actually growing this product. It's kind of those ideas of the slow food movement. And so I think producers in Hawaii are in a great place to leverage that by telling the stories and by sharing, at least with the mainland market, a common language. But even without a common language, there's so many great ways to sort of make that linkage to your buyers. So it's like, how well is Hawaii prepared to kind of meet this challenge? And here's another one, right? I think roasting companies are really thinking deeply, and retailers as well, about how they can be more equitable in all of their decisions. I mean, there's a lot of discussion right now in sort of equity just within the cafe and amongst cafe staff and local communities, and moving specialty coffee retail out of the world of sort of a colonizer of gentrification. And I think an interesting part of this is if cafes are sort of committed to providing a living wage for their employees, how are producers sort of incentivized to do the same, right? Kind of an equal footing as an expert in this industry. I think it's always interesting, this kind of loops us back a little bit to think about Hawaii in this kind of global context and in this context of who you're competing with. Joan talked about the sort of technification of some of the larger farms in Hawaii, which of course is echoed on a massive scale in Brazil and Vietnam, who control half of the world's coffee production. And then, that's sort of contrasted by the 3 countries that actually contain half of the world's coffee farms on a very small scale. So I think, the slide I wanted to put up here because, countries like Ethiopia, Uganda, and Indonesia, in a lot of ways, echo that sort of, 1 to 5 acre coffee farm that you see throughout so much of Hawaii. And so, even though Hawaii is this kind of, blip on the radar, this was the latest number I could find. Joan can probably correct the 0.04% of global production if that's off by a little bit.
It's pretty much, yeah, it's very, very tiny. I think the point that we're making here, without getting hung up on the number, is that we are a very, very tiny origin that sells coffee at very high prices. And so that automatically limits the markets in which we're able to sell.
Right, but I also think it means that you can sort of point to other countries and origins that have succeeded as tiny producers. I mean, Panama's a blip on the radar, and they're kind of the darling right now. Ethiopia just today was the Cup of Excellence Ethiopia auction, where these were tiny farmers with very small lots that had just kind of been invisible. These are not producers that most of us had ever heard of before in Ethiopia. And now we see, the top lots were earning $185 a pound for, and not like tiny 100-pound lots. These were 600 pounds. Not a massive lot, but a nice chunk of income. So, I kind of wanted just to set that global context because I do think it's important to have these examples. And one, I think something that you're already doing and you're doing well and you're doing like other origins is this idea of flavor mapping and developing the map that Joan showed. This is an example of a very similar project I was involved with in Peru, where we kind of took the main growing regions there and came up with flavor profiles. But in the case of Hawaii, what I really wonder is, how do you get even more granular with that? How do you take Kona and then start flavor mapping, particular valleys with microclimates, or microclimates at one side of a farm versus another, and really getting sort of into the details, even beyond that. And then, is there a value in sort of taking a page out of wine or cheese, where there's really like sort of protected appellations and denominations of origin? And this is great. I see, Sharon here is saying, I think that varieties need to be a part of the map as well. And 100%, it's sort of all of that. And this is work that World Coffee Research is undertaking right now, is sort of multi-variety trials and single examples of terroir. So you start seeing how varieties and farm management works, and you can kind of dive in as much as you want. And I'm actually going to skip ahead because that's exactly what one of our clients has done, which is Geisha Village in Ethiopia. This is a map of their farm. This is a huge farm. It's 500 hectares. And in order to manage that, they've divided it into these sub-farms that all share kind of a common, terroir. Like Surma is on a little bit of a plateau. There isn't much elevation difference. It's kind of forested in the same way, which, is very different from what you see like at Narsha, the yellow spot over here. And, what they've been able to do with that is each one of these plots grows only one variety. So they're really getting granular on the varieties that are grown there. There's only 3 varieties that they really focus on. But at the end of the day, this is last year's auction that we organized for this farm. You can see they're able to come up with all of these micro lots of the plot, the variety, Geisha 1931, or Gori Geisha, or there's Ilubabor forest, then the processing method. And they've been able to create these really unique products for very specific customers. So I think it's thinking about, as a coffee producer, your farm and your opportunities to be very responsive to individual customers. And Joan, can you talk a little bit about your experience in like Taiwan and selling these nano lots and small?
Yeah, and so basically, the grant writing that I do, we get market access program funds. So it's MAP funding through the USDA, and we're able to use that funding to promote sales of Hawaiian coffee in one region. So we are currently in China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. That's all considered one area. The work that we've been doing has primarily been in Taiwan right now. So last year we took 2 trips to Taiwan, one in April, and then Madeline was part of the research trip that was there in November. So some of the things that they are really interested in there are traceability back to the farm, primarily because there's so much concern over fraud in food. And so, of course, we can't do that here in Hawaii on an official scale because our certification process can trace coffee back to a particular mill where it was dry milled, but not back to the farm itself. So these personal relationships between the farmers and the buyers are going to be very important. And some of the things that we have coming up, once hopefully COVID gets, becomes not a pandemic soon, are a reverse trade mission where we would like to bring some of these buyers here to Hawaii so that they can directly cup. And then also, again, as I'd mentioned earlier, is for the Hawaii Coffee Association to have a booth at the Taiwan International Coffee Show so that we can have farmers there meeting people directly on the ground. Now, as far as the product itself, in terms of what they're looking for, it's Panama Geisha that's really setting the standard, I think. And so what that means is that folks are looking for very small amounts, less than 25 pounds, vacuum sealed. You need to have a certain cup score. And so a lot of what I had heard was, 86 points or higher would be ideal. And all of that is kind of based on these micro and nano lot auctions like this example here that Marcus has on screen. And that is generally true in other parts of Asia as well. I mean, the areas where we have the most experience are in Korea and Japan and Taiwan, and that's kind of a similarity there as well. And as you can see, just as an example, I'm looking at the highest bidder over here, Saza Coffee. That's we know those guys. They're in Japan. You go through the Cup of Excellence auctions, and you will definitely see a lot of Asian importers and roasters within the top 10 buyers.
Yeah, and I think and it's challenging because it is these tiny vacuum packed bags. When we send coffee from our farms in Panama, it's vacuum packed 1 kilo bags.
Right.
but yeah, being able to kind of understand what those customers want and craft a lot that they feel like is just for them, right? Through some experimental processing or special fermentation project, or identifying a nano corner of your farm that your most important buyer can really put their name on and kind of have the first right of refusal for that coffee is a huge part of it.
Yeah. And I see there's a question here from Sharon
Mm-hmm.
about more info about map funding. Yeah, so basically this is how map funding works. It's not supposed to help any particular farmer sell. What it does is it sets up programs for so that we can generically promote. So for example, the Specialty Coffee Association Expo that we attend every year, we use the map funding to revamp that booth. So it used to be a much smaller booth and more limited in terms of the products that we would have for folks to taste. But in recent years, now that we've got a bigger footprint and we've got a better presentation, we've held more interesting cuppings. So cuppings of just coffees from each of these 8 different regions. We've had different processing cuppings. So I remember one that we did that was primarily yeast. So just different types of yeast fermentations that farmers were doing. So basically what happens there is that we promote these coffees and the entire region of Hawaii as this dynamic, interesting, innovative region, and just pretty much show people some of the things that we're doing here. And then if folks want to connect with specific farmers, we go ahead and give them general contact lists and give them some guidance on who they might want to contact. But it's not meant to be like to say, oh, here's farmer A, and we're selling this particular lot through a booth that is map funded, because we're not allowed to do that. Now, having said that, we are looking into alternative funding from USADA, and we still haven't worked this out, but if we can work that out, then we can have our booth that's map funded, where you can have all the generic promotions right next to a booth that would be a space for farmers to specifically sell their own coffees. So if we can get those two together, and that's the second piece that we're working on, then we would certainly encourage everyone to say, hey, if you're able to fly in for the show, then you can book a spot, and then you have a place where you can promote your own coffee. But that's something that we're still trying to work out the funding for.
Yeah, and I think that's so powerful, because when you look at the competition, right, the other countries that are populated by so many small growers, you see that when you go to Expo, right? You see the Panama booth, and that's either at HCA Expo. It's especially the case in Japan and Korea, where it's all of these quote rock star producers that are there kind of hawking their coffee directly, and paying the best baristas to stand there and prepare the coffee and hand it out, and really making it kind of like a marketing carnival. So I hope that comes together.
Yeah, and we're also trying to get that same funding for that booth where farmers can actually sell to happen at the Taiwan show as well. So
yeah, I was gonna say that in Taiwan, that's what we noticed. I mean, Panama Geisha Panama in general has been so popular in Taiwan, and they had, it seemed like a couple dozen producers there brewing coffees, showcasing farms and the whole region in general. But I mean, to be able to see Hawaii participate at the same level would be amazing. And I think that being able to make that happen would be very, very helpful for a lot of our producers here. And I kind of wanted to go ahead, Marcus.
Oh yeah, I was just going to add to that I think, producers even today, kind of outside of the MAP funding, can find opportunities to do that in a clever way, right? Like,
Yes.
who's one of your best, roasting companies that's purchasing your coffee where one of these shows is happening, right? See if you can donate a little bit of coffee to that roaster, and in turn they give you a space at their booth to sort of stand and have like a meet the producer moment where, you can use their participation as a stand-in to build your own business. Or, do you already have a good relationship with a cafe that has a strong relationship with an equipment manufacturer, and your coffee gets featured at the Slayer booth at a trade show for a few hours in the afternoon? So kind of there's these official channels, but there's also being a little bit creative and seeking out opportunities and leveraging the relationships you already have to further get your name out there.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And one thing I kind of wanted to talk about too is, well, kind of summarizing all of this is that, we're focusing on an Asian market right now as an industry through our grant funding, right? And through these different partnerships. And specifically, Taiwan, Korea, and Hong Kong, is that correct?
Well, the MAP funding itself goes to marketing in China and Hong Kong and Taiwan. However, one of the things that's really great about working with Taiwan is that Taiwan is a foodie destination in Asia. So I know travel's kind of down right now because of COVID-19, but that's going to come back at some point. And Taipei especially has this reputation of being on the cutting edge of food. So so you can tell us, Madeline, you were at the Taiwan International Coffee Show. That attracts a lot of buyers, not just in Taiwan, but throughout Asia as well. And so basically having the MAP funding to work in these particular markets is a gateway to all of Asia proper. Especially if you take the time to reach out to people before these trade shows happen and find out, are you coming to Taiwan, right?
And one thing I kind of wanted you to touch on, Joan, too, because we discussed this before, was while we're kind of looking at Asia as a whole, they're very different. These different countries do business differently, and they have different, expectations or customs and ways that they're used to, making business deals. And for somebody who doesn't know anything about that, it can be very intimidating and scary to be like, how do I make this work? And so you provided, like I said, in our previous discussion, just some really interesting tidbits of insight. And I wondered if you could kind of break that down for us really quickly too.
Yeah, sure. Well, one of the funny things is that I didn't tell you guys before is that karaoke is kind of important. So if you like to sing and you want to do some business in Asia, definitely bone up on that, because at some point in multiple areas, multiple countries, you might be asked to go out and do some karaoke. So, and that turns out to be kind of an important thing. But okay, so we'll walk through it. Japan, for example, when we first started going to trade shows as Rusty's Hawaiian, folks always told us, don't expect to make a lot of deals in the first year. They want to see you come back year after year after year to make sure that you're not a flash in the pan. So by the time year 3 rolls around, you'll get more interest, and by the time year 5 rolls around, they'll know to look for you every year at that same trade show. So that's definitely true. It's just a lot of nurturing and time for those relationships, but once you get them, they're pretty rock solid. And then in Korea, things can move a lot faster in terms of purchasing. And the folks who are importers and wholesalers, they're also very forward about courting your business, about saying like, oh, you should work with me as an importer because of X, Y, and Z, and I'm really good at this, So it's a totally different style from Japan in that way. And so when we first started working in Korea, we just noticed the difference. And then in Taiwan, as I'd said earlier, that the food safety is really paramount. Everyone's worried about counterfeit food, so they want to know all sorts of things about your growing operation, and then just develop really, really close relationships with people. And their meals are very important. So, we'll hear stories about how folks went over and they said, oh yeah, well, we had to do first dinner and second dinner, and then maybe even a third dinner. And so there's a lot of business relationships that are developed over eating. So it's just things like that folks should be aware of. And there's enough of us here in Hawaii who've done business in places like that. So you can always certainly ask. I guess another thing that I would add is important everywhere, but certainly in particular for Japan, is having a very nice business card holder. And there's a whole a method of presenting your business cards, right? So it involves, you basically hold your card in both hands, And the name cannot be facing you. The name has to be facing the person who you're giving it to. And then there's just a little bow and you say hajimemashite. And that's kind of like the business greeting for very nice to meet you. And they'll do the same thing. And then you do an exchange, and then, you know, you have to read the card, and it's an acknowledgement. So there's a whole little kind of almost like a ceremony that goes on there. So these are just things that you pick up over time. But, you know, the biggest thing if you're going to be working in Japan is patience. If you're going to be working in Taiwan, you know, super close relationships. And again, things can move a bit faster in Korea. And then you're just going to have to figure out if you want to go exclusively with one importer versus another, because they're all going to court you quite heavily.
Yeah, we've found in Taiwan, yeah, you kind of have to make your decision and stick with it, because it is very competitive amongst importers there. And
Yeah.
if there's any hint that you're kind of playing both sides of the table a little bit, you might not get any business. Whereas if you just can kind of make that commitment to the one you feel strongest about, it can go quite well. John, I'm just curious, because you talked about trade shows and things, but outside of a trade show, do you have recommendations for kind of building relationships in these countries?
You know, we've personally found travel to be very important. And I know that's not the greatest answer, given that we're in the middle of a pandemic. But especially if you're, and I should back up and say that if you are selling green beans and you're looking to sell on the green market, it's always very useful to visit these countries and just get a tour of the cafes. You know, get a tour of what do folks want. We've noticed, for example, that in Taiwan, you know, and this makes sense if you think of the really bold flavors in their cuisine, you can sell a lot of natural coffee in Taiwan, right?
Yeah, we've seen the same thing around the cupping table with cupping with Wilfred Lamastus and some students that were in Panama with him. And we had gone around the cupping table and tasted all of these top coffees. And he kind of pulls me aside and he's like, hey, you've got like 2 clients from Hong Kong and a client from Taiwan here. Which coffees do you think they're going to want? And we could just tell right off the bat, it was those, like the bigger, like louder the naturals, the better.
Yeah, exactly. So that, you know, and again, that makes sense if you think of their cuisine. I mean, one of the things that folks, when you go to Taiwan, people will try to bring you to a stinky tofu restaurant, right? And so that makes perfect sense if you think of the cuisine there. And then some of the things that we've noticed, like in a lot of Japan still, some of the roasts, there's plenty of lighter roasting going on, but there are definitely some areas that still do darker roasting there. And we've just found with our own clients for Rusty's Hawaiian that if we are with a primarily Japanese audience, that the roasting that we do is a medium roast for the mainland US, often they feel it's too bright. They're looking for something a little bit darker. So we actually developed what we call Japanese medium specifically for that market. So a lot of it is knowing, you know, understanding your market that you're trying to be in. And again, a lot of that comes through travel, unfortunately, is getting to be on the ground and getting to taste for yourself what is it that they are looking for.
No, that's great. I think that's fascinating. Thank you.
Another thing I kind of wanted to bring up here too is because we talked about scoring, right? And I don't know if anybody on this who's viewing this presentation was also on the attended the presentation yesterday with our coffee scoring systems panel. And Kim Westerman of Coffee Review was also on that panel and talked about the differences in coffee review scoring versus SCA, CQI scoring, and coffee reviews market in Taiwan specifically, but in Asia in general, is growing rapidly. And so it's become this massive marketing tool in Taiwan, and I saw it everywhere there. People were advertising what their scores for coffee review coffees were all over the place. And so, and those scoring systems they play out in different ways. So even if your coffee maybe doesn't get an 86 in an SCA sheet, it might get an 86 or above on the coffee review because the objective is a little bit different. And so use these other companies too and their marketing power, because they, you know, someone like Coffee Review has a huge following right now in Asia. And so there's a lot of marketing power behind that.
Yeah, yeah, and same with Cup of Excellence, right? Those are scores are usually, it's a different score sheet, so the scores come out differently, right? That 86 on the COE form might be an 88 or 89. So that's fascinating. Yeah, and Joan, I loved what you said about that sort of reliability and that relationship and traceability. And it seems, I put this slide in here just because we had talked about kind of how do you tell your story about who you are.
Yeah.
And this is just a screenshot that I grabbed from the Sustainable Harvest website. It's a cooperative that I'm a member of, so it's near and dear to my heart. But you can see the sort of level of detail that these producer profiles can get into. And I love the idea of how you think about, sort of profiling yourself as a farmer on your own website, in your promotional materials, but also using that, in some ways as kind of an informal traceability, right? Even if you're a very small farmer and you're paying another company to process your coffee, like a larger farm, that's all part of your story and who you are. And sort of, that idea of keeping your unique coffee and your unique plot kind of distinct and special might be part of that. And thinking about what it means to tell that story and how unique you are, and how if you hire somebody like Joan as an agronomist to help you with your processes, talk about that, right? It's
Oh, I'm not an agronomist,
well,
but
with that kind of expertise. So
And kind of, looking at this whole idea of the importance of differentiation of your product through, not just through quality, but also through those personal stories, through those connections, through relationship buying and practices, and so it's those that go together really well. And it isn't always just about quality. It isn't always just about the story, but if you can provide both of those together, that's going to allow you to have long-lasting relationships with buyers as well.
Yeah, and it's huge. And I just saw in the chat that Sharon was talking about Holotree having an app that traces the whole process starting from the farm. So there's somebody in the HCA that's already developing this. And I know Cropster, right, has their whole traceability system, the Cropster farm piece, where, it really is, it's keeping track of like that day's harvest all the way through how it was processed, what the drying time was, and maybe keeping that lot separate all the way to the end of the season. And as kind of a final step, tasting everything and deciding what gets blended into a more macro lot and what is maybe kept aside as kind of a nano micro special lot, and tying that as to what the flavor preferences are of your customers. So it can be really powerful. And things, other things that I think are so excited, and of course Hawaii is no stranger to sort of leveraging coffee tourism as a major selling point, with like the Kona Coffee Belt, for example. But there's the Ruthas del Cafe in Colombia, which saw local production increase dramatically, and I think that of course is challenged in this day of COVID, right? So it's thinking how we sort of get beyond that, because roasting and growing the local market is going to be super important, but that local market might be without the benefit of tourism for quite some time. But I think I'm really curious on this last bullet point, Joan. You had talked about quality standards and what's happening on the ground in Hawaii there.
Oh, yeah. So we have these specific grading standards, and we have voluntary certification. And basically, these are the standards that determine whether your coffee is extra fancy, number one, select, or prime. Those are the exportable grades that can be traced to your particular area. And so we use them in particular because, especially for selling green coffee, because it's nice to have the government seal of quality there. In other words, there's been someone at the state level who has cupped the coffee and can verify for what it is, and then you've got your bag that's sealed and the actual tag is stitched into the bag. So these are all really good safeguards when you're selling green coffee to someone under a green coffee contract. So if someone comes back later and says, oh, there's a dispute over what you sold me, I don't think that I got what we had agreed upon, you actually have that state backing that says, this was actually verified. But having said that, it's a voluntary certification. It's not, certainly you don't need to do it in order to make these sales. We just like to do it as practice because it's just, in our view, better for everyone. But in any case, those state standards, when we had the problem of the coffee berry borer come up, basically we had the standards as far as the number of defects, for example, that you could have were relaxed a bit. And recently they've been sunsetted. So I think it is July 1st, is it, that it goes back up to what these originally used to be. And so if you're trying to sell really large amounts of extra fancy certified coffee, this poses a great difficulty, because in order to do that, you've got to pull the pinholes out. Everybody knows who's working with coffee here, coffee berry borer. It's easy with the optical sorters that we have now to pull out something that has a lot of bug damage, but something that has one tiny hole, the technology that we have now is not going to be able to pull those out. And so you're pretty much not going to be able to certify large amounts of extra fancy. Now, if you're wanting to create a very small, tiny lot and you're willing to hand pick it out. And we've done this in the past, by the way. We've had clients like, okay, well, you're still going to have to pay the certification fee, which is pretty expensive, but we can go ahead and hand sort this for you and charge you for that. And we've had clients who've done it. But if you're used to selling, say, 100-pound sacks of extra fancy, you pretty much won't be able to do it for an affordable cost. And so what that means is that we're going to have to re-educate all of the buyers who are used to buying extra fancy, in these large amounts, and explain to them how the standards have changed, and then in terms of what we are able to sell to them. So it's just a re-education process is really what it is.
Consistent communication with your buyers, and making sure that they know these are changing, this is how it will or will not affect us, things like that, and just so that they're prepared versus, having an unexpected surprise down the line or something.
Right, exactly.
So, I'm definitely just like a huge advocate for communicating as much as you can, especially even over communicating sometimes. I think just letting people know that is, these are the changes that are happening right now in our industry. And so this is, again, like how it may affect us or how it may not affect us. And and I think also one thing that I brought up in our discussion previously was it kind of goes back to the long-term practices and goals of maintaining your CBB, making sure that stays under control and not letting it get out of control again. And hopefully we have a lot of the support and technology to make that happen. And if somebody feels like they don't have that, reach out to HCA and we will point you in the right direction. We will get you in contact with the people who can provide resources and provide information on how to deal with CBB or any other problem that you might be having on your farm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the other thing that I wanted to point out, and I know we keep hammering back to this point, but this is where the relationships come in very, very important, right? So we have this huge grading standard change, and now you're having to explain this to folks. And if you already have a strong relationship with a buyer who you've provided good service to, who trusts your quality, they're still going to trust you to give them good coffee. But again, like kind of what you said, Madeline, key to that is that over communication, and it's a lot easier to do that if you have a strong relationship with someone, whereas if you're coming to someone for the very first time. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's just another touch point with your customers, right? I think it's the roasters that are buying, your green coffee especially. I mean, they're looking to you to be sort of the expert in navigating buying coffee from Hawaii.
Right.
You're probably the only person that they know. And as these things change, I mean, what a great opportunity to pick up the phone and call them, even if it's not the actual time you're looking to sign the contract, but just to keep that conversation going and to make yourself, available as that expert to assuage any of their concerns. Updates on your website, or pointing them, in your email newsletter to resources coming from HCA and new information.
Yeah, absolutely.
Andrea from CTAR is on this call. I didn't realize that, but she just shared her email address in the chat. So if anybody, she is like my go-to person. I direct everybody to her. And if you're not on her newsletter too, she sends out regular emails and things as well. So you can sign up for that through the CTAR website. Definitely, she's an amazing asset and resource to our local coffee industry.
That's fantastic. But yeah, I mean, I think my like sort of last talking point on this slide, and to think about ways that Hawaii can continue to be successful and to become even more successful on the market is how can the sort of larger farms that are maybe currently sort of functioning as aggregators and just buying cherries from the smallest farms, right? How can they start functioning maybe more as centralized processors? And I know we're kind of looping back to this idea of technology to trace farm lots and things, but bringing these tools and these kind of operational pieces in to kind of identify hidden gems amongst these very smallest growers that might have unique varieties, unique terroir, and just find those extra special coffees. Don't just aggregate them into like a larger sort of typical macro lot, but keep those separate, cup them individually, share those results with those individual farmers, even if it's just a tiny, farm that's just a garden plot in somebody's house, in their backyard. Because I also think that's where these sort of hidden gems of Hawaiian coffee might make themselves known. Because just thinking about, Kona coffee as kind of one profile, we know that that's not the case because there's too many factors that go into it from elevation, and it's such a great start. But
yeah, and this is where I think that like that flavor mapping, that profile mapping project would be fascinating, that you touched on earlier. And I think that that's something that would be really beneficial and helpful for our local industry. And so, it takes data. It takes a lot of data and information, and bringing that all together into one cohesive space and making sense of it all. And yeah, we know that it is, like you just said, it is not a homogeneous profile. There is a lot of variation, and that's what makes it exciting and beautiful. And that's what makes it possible for people to break into unique markets and differentiate themselves as well.
Yeah, I mean, for folks who are outside of Hawaii listening to this, I mean, this is a place that's built on microclimates. So, you can drive 10 minutes and be at a significantly different elevation and a significantly different rainfall. So it is very interesting to live here. But going along with that idea, Marcus, so my head's already starting to turn as someone who's a grant writer, right? And one of the projects that we have coming up here in Ka'u is we're actually getting weather stations at various farms at different areas of Ka'u. And part of that is it's going to be able to measure everything from rainfall to solar radiation. And those are weather stations that are tied to a project that's all about cover crops. And we're testing out different cover crops at these different locations to be able to create recommendations for coffee farmers throughout the state to say, hey, if you are at this elevation and you've got this type of rainfall and you've got soil that's similar to this, then maybe this particular cover crop that we've tested out that worked out well in this area will work on your farm. So the whole goal is to basically increase resilience amidst climate change, and then also increase soil health. But tying it back to the flavor mapping, we could, at least in Ka'u, use that weather data. And then you've also have the USDA soil map. So anyone who's a farmer, I think most of us know, right, that there's the soil map app from from the federal government that you can log into and basically find out the type of soil that's actually on your farm, and even be able to break it down, like part of my farm has this soil and part of my farm has another type of soil. So I'm just thinking, my head's spinning with all the data points that we could put into this, just from someone who's, like a data geek. So
Yeah, me too. We get lost in the weeds of this, but I think,
right. Right.
but the idea of like, finding those kind of hidden gems might really be the key to, kind of a new way of marketing and talking about coffee in the market, because then you do start to know, like, wow, this is the coffee for this customer. This is the coffee for this customer. This is the coffee that becomes that macro lot.
So have you found those really helpful, that flavor mapping, in terms of being able to sell an entire region? Because again, thinking as a grant writer, to get money to do that kind of thing, it's not to help any particular farm, but if it's something that helps the entire region or regions of Hawaii and garners more interest and elevates what they do, then we might be able to make a case. But
yeah, no, I mean, I think that it becomes, it's quite interesting, and it's worked. I showed the flavor mapping for Peru, but you can see the same kind of work has been done in Honduras,
right.
And and they've leveraged that to get even larger grants. We've worked on a larger project with the European Union, kind of the EU equivalent of USAID, to promote coffees from El Paraíso, one of those kind of unique terroirs that's grown there, and doing dedicated cupping times at the booth for Honduras at different trade shows in Europe and the US, and really sort of talking about what makes that unique. So that kind of elevates everybody, because it makes it more efficient for buyers then as well, that maybe they are really looking to grow their inventory of Hawaiian coffee of a certain profile, and there's no more to buy from their current producer. So they need to look out for new producers. So I think it really is the kind of rising tide lifts all boats idea. In addition to just, I love what you're talking about with the weather stations and things, and understanding weather and soil, because that just makes any farm more resilient, to take your word. But also, people establishing new farms or rejuvenating farms, it gives them a lot more data to make wise decisions, to sort of target, are you going to go for higher yield? Are you going to go for higher cupping score? Are you going to go for, it just gives you more tools to manage your business.
Yeah, and gives you more, the weather stations ideally give you more tools to manage when to place the inputs at your farm, and that kind of information. So
that's powerful.
Yeah, it is very powerful. And something I wanted to also just kind of bring up is, we're talking about all these different ways of kind of sharing information about Hawaii coffee, and we touched on it a little bit about how trade shows are not happening right now, so that's difficult. And how do we connect with possible new markets if we're not already established? And I have to say, like, there are a lot of people who are just using webinars. There are a lot of people who are just communicating online and doing video calls, and people are still drinking coffee, is something else to remember. We may not be drinking it in cafes or restaurants, but people are drinking coffee at home. And we don't know if, nobody can predict what will happen with these different consuming trends, but people are still drinking coffee. And the people who have been pretty okay during this time are the people who have been able to access the home brewing market, the folks who have a strong retail brand where they have e-commerce available. And we have, they're selling to grocery stores and things like that. And so if that's not a part of your market yet, maybe it could be. And if you're not able to do roasted product, there are still ways to sell green coffee, and a lot of it is honestly relying on webinar technology. And there are constantly new events that are happening online all the time, and it takes time to like figure out everything that's going on and where it's happening and when. And sometimes it's not an ideal time for Hawaii. There was a 5 a.m. webinar this morning, and it was about a topic that I'm interested in. And there was a 5 a.m. webinar a few weeks ago that I was like, all right, I'm going to get up and listen to this and see who I can connect with or see what kind of conversations I can participate in. And so it's shifting, from spending the time and traveling somewhere for 3 days or 4 days of a trade show to let's spend an hour at a not so convenient time on a video call with some people around the world and see what happens and connecting with people.
Yeah.
I love that. And go ahead, Joan, sorry.
No, yeah. And of course, a lot of what we've been talking about is selling green coffee, right? And so that distinction does need to be made. But what Madeline's saying in terms of getting really creative, like this obviously is a crowd that is very geared towards green coffee, but also a lot of folks who are selling roasted at the farms. So in terms of what you were saying, Madeline, and how to find these webinars that can introduce your coffee to new places, my mom and I, we just did another one that was sponsored by the Philippine Consulate that was all about Filipino Food Week here in Hawaii. And so we had this great conversation with the roaster who's up in Vancouver, and she's roasting coffees from the Philippines, and we're Filipinos growing coffee here. But it was a way to kind of, something that's very different, not technical in any way in terms of how we're discussing now, but it's a way of introducing yourselves to new audiences. And so I would definitely encourage everyone who's a farmer, and especially if you're a roaster, figure out all sorts of whatever, there's all sorts of online events going on. Just figure out what you can participate in that's tied to your story in some way, that where you're able to promote. And then that's another way of opening up new audiences.
Yeah, I think 100%. It's when I think about COVID and people not traveling, and I think about coffee in that context, right? I mean, there could be a huge opportunity to really promote and like aggressively promote with paid social media and with really pushing your email list. And it's something that's as blatant as, well, hey, you can't come to Hawaii right now, but why not have a little bit of Hawaii in your morning cup of coffee, right? Like, people are drinking coffee at home, and how can you really be out there to make sure that it's your coffee that they're drinking? And if you're primarily selling green coffee, it's maybe now's the time that you reach out to the roasting companies globally that are buying your coffee, or the importers, whatever your supply chain looks like, and pitching them on how you can help them sell more coffee, right? It's those ideas, help them tell your story to their customers, help them come up with some sort of a plan to promote Hawaiian coffee right now, so that your coffee's again kind of front and center with people. So
I think that's a good idea. Yeah, I mean, contacting the people who you're already importing through and asking, how can we share our story more broadly and have more of your customers interested in our coffee? What kind of information is required to make that happen?
Right? Like, the wine industry has totally exploded with these virtual wine tastings now. I mean, I hear about it from my mom and dad like every weekend. They're like, oh, we got our 3 bottles of wine and tuned into this webinar to taste wine with 600 other people. Like, these things are massive. Like, it could be a really cool, I mean, that could be a whole HCA initiative to consumers in its own right.
Yeah, that's a good idea, actually. Massive coffee tasting. Massive coffee tasting. Yeah, and I see that Karen has jumped in here from the Seal Equality program. So I do want to make a mention here how we're talking about selling Hawaiian coffee as bringing a little bit of Hawaii to you, as opposed to you coming here, if you're a tourist. And this is actually a trend that's going on with multiple industries. So I do some grant writing for the floriculture industry here too. And what we're seeing is just sales of potted plants, for example, going up. Because especially during the lockdown, everybody was stuck at home and they wanted to beautify their indoor spaces and bring some nature inside. Obviously not everybody is able to walk outside like we are here in Hawaii and have pretty much gorgeous scenery all around. So they've got to create it. So that Seal Equality program that the Hawaii Department of Agriculture has, we as Rusty's Hawaiian are part of that. And basically, they verify that the products that you're selling are, Hawaii made, Hawaii grown, and it doesn't just apply to coffee, it applies to a whole wide range of foodstuffs. And that seal of quality marker, we've noticed that in Japan, that's helped out for sure. That's something that is recognized there. And actually to some degree with the tourist market of Japanese folks who come here, some of them will know to look for that seal of quality. Yeah. But yeah, capitalizing on that trend of bringing Hawaii to everybody, it's not just coffee that's doing that. It's that's big business in a number of different ways.
Totally. There are a couple of questions here that I did want to address kind of before we continue on with this discussion. One of them is, do we know what percentage of market share Hawaii coffees enjoy in the U.S. market?
Oh, in the U.S. market, I don't know.
U.S. market specifically. I know it's a very specific question, and so I don't have that information.
You know what? I'd have to crunch the numbers. I'd have to leave for about 5 minutes and crunch the numbers. But it's available. It's available online through the GATS data system. And I wonder if I don't know how this webinar is going to be played later, but I'm happy to teach people how to actually look for this themselves, because there's all sorts of ways you can look at the numbers, and it's all funded by the federal government. So I don't know. Okay. I don't think it makes sense for me to take, up to 10 minutes right now to do it, but I'm happy to teach somebody how to do it.
Yeah, maybe we can just send a follow-up just to the attendees of this one.
Okay, sure. That's fine.
Whenever you are able to get it in GADS, GADS, right?
GATS. GAT is in Tom S. Yeah, so it's GATS data. And it's a bit of an unwieldy interface to deal with, but it might even make sense if I shoot video off of my iPhone over how to navigate through it. But that's actually the official data that we use when we're applying for USDA grants.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's very useful. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. And then also, do we know what the largest growth market for Hawaii coffee is?
Joan, that might be a good chance to advance to some of your slides about
Yeah.
Right? Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is probably is a good segue. Okay, so this passport report. So there's an international market research firm called Euromonitor that puts out all sorts of terrific information about different foodstuffs. Pretty much everything, but they have a particularly strong focus on the hot drinks market internationally. So they just happened to do this report. Now you'll see the date on this, January 2020. This is pre-COVID. Let's just throw that in. So when I was going through the report to figure out what slides to bring up, I figured that it would be best for us to stick with some of the long-term effects, because we don't know how COVID is going to scramble things in the short and medium term. So, and this kind of ties into some of the stuff we were talking about earlier in terms of consolidation in the industry. All right, so we've got climate change. Everybody knows, massive threat, right? Earlier in this report, what I was surprised to learn, because we're always thinking about the threat of climate change to Arabica. Everybody knows we keep talking about elevation here. Elevation is really a proxy for temperature. Cooler temperatures will give you, in general, brighter flavors in your coffee. Some of these prized flavors that we look for in Cup of Excellence and other competitions really come about with coffees grown at higher elevation. So if you want to maintain that type of flavor profile, you got to keep moving up the mountain. And of course, that's anyone who's set up a farm knows how incredibly labor intensive and capital intensive that is. So not everybody's going to be able to do that. But the other thing that I saw there that I was a bit surprised to learn was that they were estimating that the growing area for Robusta could be cut by as much as 50% with climate change. Now, we deal less with Robusta here in Hawaii, and I guess I had just always thought in my head that Robusta would be more resilient, but they were saying, no, that could be dramatically cut as well. So, as it says here, it's disrupting coffee's traditional growth regions, and this long-term adaptation is going to be expensive, and how many of these small farms can really afford to keep moving up the mountain? So and then the other part here that they're talking about is the low green coffee prices globally. And over time, these twin forces of climate change and the low green coffee prices are basically going to push a lot of the smaller guys out, and then concentrate coffee growing in these areas that do have a lot of money and capital behind them. So Brazil and Vietnam. So as Marcus had mentioned earlier, so much of our volume of our world's coffee is already concentrated in Brazil and Vietnam. I would say
two markets that are making money on coffee, even in a $1 market, right? I mean, they're so technified and they're so volume based that they can play in that world that's impossible for Hawaii or Ethiopia for very different reasons. But
yeah, I would say for us here in Hawaii, one of the ways to safeguard against this is to build upon what many of us are already doing and have a roasted brand. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to sell all your coffee as roasted or all your coffee as green. I mean, we do both. And frankly, in times like this, when you've got this global pandemic, the more market, the more ways that you have to, make money for yourself, the more different markets and coffee that you're in, the more resilient you'll be. So by taking at least part of your crop all the way to roasted and building a brand around that could help offset some of these shocks that are coming. And again, with this adaptation could mean less interesting coffee. So we've been talking about the third wave movement, which has been really, really driven by a lot of innovations in brewing, a lot of innovations at the processing level. And so, this is a very coffee geeky segment of the industry. And so the big question is, how is climate change going to affect this? Because some of these flavors that we're used to just will not, we're not going to be able to produce them at perhaps like the scale that we're doing now. Okay, so next slide. Yeah, so again, this greater consolidation here. The part of this slide that really interested me, the bullet points to the left kind of indicate where we are. We've got all of these really terrific coffee shop chains, very specialized, highlighting producers, highlighting processing methods, highlighting different varieties of coffee and different methods of brewing. But as we move more into these areas of low prices and climate change, let's see, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So bullet point number 5 here, talking about this pool of coffee producers likely narrowing, with farmers switching to different crops or leaving coffee altogether, right? And so you're going to see that shrink. And they're predicting that a middle tier of specialty coffee could be squeezed out. So that's so we don't know exactly how that's going to play out. It's hard to say. Is that going to mean that only the folks who are growing these coffee, that only the coffees that are being auctioned off at these super high prices are going to remain, and then the lower level of specialty coffee will no longer be profitable to produce? I don't know. This is an interesting point that's brought up by Euromonitor, and we'll just have to see how this plays out. But this last point here is sort of interesting, and I think this is true, that those of us who are in this industry, in the specialty coffee industry, have a tendency to be very, very geeky. But many, many people out there are just, they want a nice coffee shop to sit in. They want to have their caffeine. They want to have a nice cappuccino, but they're not as driven by, oh, we need these new flavors and new origins all of the time.
And as Trade Coffee, the large reseller of roasted coffee, right? As they've done their data analysis and have shared that information, like at RICO and at SCA, right? It's people want sort of dark roasted, chocolatey, nutty coffee, right? They don't want this kind of third wave coffee geek profile.
Right. Yeah.
So it isn't. I mean, I think that we've seen that bullet point sort of played out in anecdotal cases, in market-driven data, and in this report as well.
Right. So yeah. So as those low prices and climate change continue, we'll just have to see how this goes. But these are all predictions here. And I think there's one more slide. Right here. Okay. So what stood out to me, kind of along the lines of what we've been talking about, is what's in this blue box. That there may be a shift from ever more premium coffee to more ubiquitous good enough coffee, right? And the bullet point above that, talking about how the specialty segment will be the most strongly impacted, and a weaker specialty coffee segment likely means the force of premiumization, all these things that we were talking about earlier, that might become more muted. So these are all things just for people to keep track of, because we have had a conversation that's fairly heavy on the importance of winning high scores in different awards. But it may be that you do that and that's your marketing tool, but you sell a lot of coffee or more coffee that's not, you know, in that area, that doesn't score quite that high. And from a producer standpoint, that's what you want, right? Because you want to find a home for everything that you produce. You just, really what it is as a producer is matching the right coffee to the right buyer, you know?
Yeah. We use the phrase every coffee has a home,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
and the more diverse the more diverse market a producer can have, the
Right.
better.
Absolutely.
The more sustainable your business is, right? You, again, exactly what you said, being able to kind of market those really special kind of geeky coffee lots, but you have your base and your foundation of you're just solid coffee production that is not defective, but it's not like this crazy micro lot that's scoring super high that you have to do a special processing method for and whatever. It's just good coffee.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a balance of those things. And again, like I just find that it's so important to maintain diversity in your market and who you're selling to, because that'll build a healthier business.
Oh yeah,
And the sweet
absolutely.
spot is an example of like Saza coffee from that slide that I showed and that you pointed out as well, right? Like Taru will buy the craziest nano lots of coffee you produce, but they're also a major coffee company that buys a lot of like 83, 84 point coffee.
Mm-hmm.
And what a great customer, right? Like one container with multiple lots that can kind of drive your business in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. What I like to tell people is that, you know, kind of what you were talking about, Madeline, that solid stable of, you know, not the highest scoring coffee, but perfectly good coffee. That's the stuff. Sales of that is what allows us to play and experiment, right? So I never ever discount that, because that's your bread and butter. That pays you so that you can spend your time on the experimentation. So
Exactly.
yeah.
I mean, I've
Totally.
spoken to producers who are Cup of Excellence winners, and they're just like, yeah, that's great, but I still have all this other coffee that's what matters to me, you know,
Right.
and then I can play with this other stuff that I do submit to competitions and other things. And so it's important to have that solid foundation, I find. And yeah, I wonder if you all find, I mean, this is, again, it's important to remember that this report too was January, and so many things have changed in 5 months, 6 months.
Yeah, right.
So I think it'll be interesting to see how things kind of continue out to play throughout the rest of this year. And I wonder if there are other identifiable points that we need to, or maybe pain points that we need to pay attention to over the next 5 to 10 years in Hawaii that you've noticed and maybe we haven't addressed yet.
I don't know. I mean, I think honestly, everything depends on how soon we get a vaccine and how successful that vaccine is, right? I think everybody's sort of hoping that we can go back to pre-COVID days in the sense of having this really thriving cafe scene that can have a lot more seating capacity than they do currently. It's interesting to see. I mean, just looking at some of the moves that Starbucks is making and having more kiosk type, investing in more kiosk type stores. Is that indeed the wave of the future? Or is that more of, you know, a temporary thing for a few years and then people will shift back to congregating in cafes the same way that they did before? Nobody knows, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think this blue box on this slide to me is the crystal ball of at least the short-term future of COVID. Whereas I do think it's, you know, there's the whole risk of going out, there's changing the way that we're consuming coffee, but I think there is also just the stress to people's incomes as companies and the economy are fundamentally changing as well. That good enough is probably going to be good enough for a while. Good enough is definitely the kind of kiosk drive-through walk up bread and butter
and what
coffee.
I find, I mean, just in conversations with people brewing coffee at home, they're just like, I don't have the skill set or the equipment to do what my favorite barista does with the same coffee. So I'm I'm okay with going in a step down in what I'm buying, because just home brewing is different,
Right.
I hope that this also has allowed people to value their baristas more.
Yeah, to that point, when we used to do farmers markets, we would actually make a point of serving coffee in pump pots that was brewed in a regular automatic coffee maker. Now that sounds really weird, like given what we do, right? But when we have folks who are coming to us at farmers markets, they want to know, what is it going to taste like if they brew it at home? And so if it tastes good at the basic brew level, anything you do at home that's going to be hand pour, if you're skilled in that, or AeroPress, is just going to make it better. So we always made sure that we would say, okay, here's your lowest common denominator. Everybody's got a Mr. Coffee. If you like how it tastes here, you're going to enjoy this at home, right? So we would always do that, because sometimes we would get folks who would say like, oh, I'm afraid to put milk in my coffee in front of you guys because of who you are. It's like, no, don't don't stress yourself out. We just want you to enjoy what you're drinking.
Enjoy the coffee, right?
Yeah, enjoy it. So,
Sure,
so I think that could be one of those ways to combat that, because we definitely don't want people to start thinking that, oh, Hawaii is just unapproachable because it's too high priced in this time of COVID, and or saying that, oh, I can't buy really nice coffee because my barista's not preparing it for me. Like, no, you can have a perfectly enjoyable cup of Hawaiian coffee at home with your Mr. Coffee. It's really okay.
Oh yeah.
And I will say that I think the very strength of so much Hawaiian coffee is its approachability. There's very few sort of premium and super premium coffees out there. We talked about Panama and Ethiopia that are approachable, right? Those other coffees are often very weird to 99% of the coffee drinking public. Whereas
we call them polarizing coffees.
Yeah, exactly. Like they're the controversies, right? And I mean, and while of course there's profiles like that are coming from Hawaii, I think on par, it's much more approachable, and your average, coffee drinker, and we've sort of borne this out with some consumer testing we've done, they always prefer that Hawaiian kind of approachable, well-balanced coffee.
Yeah.
So that's I don't know if that's a parting note, but that's something that I get really excited about with the coffee too, is just the approachability.
Yeah. I mean, I think bottom line is we want people to enjoy their coffee. I would really hate it if all sorts of folks who thought that, well, I'm not going to buy coffee now because I can't prepare it as well as my barista. That's that would be.
Yeah. I don't see people not buying coffee. I see people being like, oh, now I kind of get it a little bit more.
Yeah, right.
But if there are any more questions, please feel free to ask. I think we have a couple more minutes here, but this has been we tried to cover quite a bit of ground here, and I hope it was insightful and informative. And again, use the resources that are available. It's what I always encourage folks. Contact HCA, contact CTAR, and people are here to help. So if that's it, I'm just going to kind of wrap up and basically give just a mahalo to you both for joining us for this discussion, and also to our sponsors for sponsoring this. We have Savor Brands over in Honolulu, Ben as our platinum sponsor, Bendig as our gold sponsor, Linda Insurance Services, and Downtown Coffee Honolulu as our silver sponsors. And if anybody's interested in supporting the Hawaii Coffee Association to continue to do things like this webinar and provide more information and resources, feel free to support us through the link that's popped up on your screen. And we look forward to offering more informative things like this in the future, and as we all kind of start navigating this virtual world a bit more on a daily basis. So thank you, everybody, and have a lovely rest of your day.
You too.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, HCA.